He's in his 35th year of advancing individual liberty and limited government. He's the leading voice of the movement. He's the president of the American Policy Center, the editor of the DeWeese Report, and we're really all here today because of his fine work. Please welcome the president of the American Policy Center, Tom DeWeese.
Attaboy, Tom. Sure do.
Good evening. I'm really pleased to be here in Santa Cruz, and I am so thrilled to see all of you here and to hear what we've got to say tonight. I wonder how many times have you wondered what our lives would be like if only the world had read and acted upon the rantings of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Could we have prevented World War II? If only the world had acted and tossed Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in a trash heap, could we have saved the world from a horror that has spread across the globe and enslaved and murdered millions? Today, I believe that you and I have another chance to change history. Today, we have a chance to learn of a new enemy to America's liberties. The questions now must be asked. Will we understand the threat, heed the warnings, and take action to stop it? The fact is, a revolution has taken place in this country, and it is now firmly entrenched. You will find this revolution oozing out of every corner of our society, from the textbooks to television to government policy. It is for implementation of this revolution that your schools have been transformed to produce the citizens to live in the new revolutionary society. This is the key to all of the outrages you have witnessed in public classrooms. It is the root to the drive away from academics and sound science. It is the reason that every classroom is filled with discussions of diversity and multiculturalism. It is the reason children are being indoctrinated to turn away from their parents and the values that you have taught them. They are being prepared to live in a different society than ours. They are not being prepared to be American citizens, but of a global village. That's why they don't need to know about American history and the Constitution and our founding fathers, because they're irrelevant. The education system today is simply an assault on your child's attitudes, values, and beliefs. It is designed to change and mold them. And if you fail to grasp this fact, you will never succeed in defeating it. The revolution is anti-property rights, anti-free enterprise, anti-individual liberty, anti-national sovereignty and national borders, and it is anti-Western culture. The goal of the revolution is to transform the world into feudal-like governance by making nature the central organizing principle for our economy and our society. This is what the leaders of the revolution believe. Let me quote. Nature has an integral set of different values, cultural, spiritual, and material, where humans are one strand of nature's web, and all living creatures are considered equal. Therefore, the natural way is right, and human activity should be molded along nature's rhythms. End quote. An agenda has been set in motion, beginning with United Nations treaties and agreements, thereby working its way down through federal to state to local government policy. The quote I just read came from the UN's Biodiversity Treaty. One of the major tools for implementing the agenda is another UN treaty called Agenda 21. Like the Biodiversity Treaty, it first surfaced at the UN's Earth Summit in 1992. The document was signed by George Bush I and is now part of official policy of our federal government at every level. Agenda 21 is the United Nations blueprint for the complete restructuring of nations to fit the proper mold for global governance. Agenda 21 outlines in detail the UN's vision for a completely managed society, dictating the process to be used for industry, for agriculture, for housing development, and education. Just listen to a few of the subheadings in Agenda 21's documents to see how all-encompassing is its reach. Global action for women, strengthening world trade and strengthening workers and trade unions, the role of business and industry, transfer of technology, the role of farmers, international cooperation, changing consumption patterns, human settlements, integrating environment and development into decision-making. This is not environmental policy. It is an all-encompassing blueprint to rule from an all-powerful central government. The common name for the policy in this nation is sustainable development. Sustainable development. If you remember nothing else that I say here tonight, remember these two words, sustainable development. And remember this, if you profess to love America's precious liberty, then sustainable development is your enemy. Sustainable development is a new threat to liberty. But sustainable development is a horror that hardly anyone in this nation understands or even cares to oppose. Ignore sustainable development at the peril of everything you hold dear: individual liberty, private property, free enterprise, free travel, free association, even life itself. Under this banner, the battle is to diminish the liberty that our founding fathers provided for us is accelerating. America is different from any nation on earth. We are wealthy beyond the comprehension of any society before us. We are strong, powerful, and healthy. For 200 years, we have prospered because we have operated under a rule of law that was designed to protect the individual's right to pursue his own life in the way he chooses, to work, to play, to invest, and to own property, and use it in the way that best suits his needs. The government, by edict of the Constitution, has the responsibility to protect such activities. This nation is the only one in the history of the world in which the Founding Fathers set out to find a style of government that would guarantee protection of individual rights and property rights. Nearly every other nation on earth began as a dictatorship or subject of a king, and most nations of the world still operate that way. The property in those nations began as the personal property of the king or the government. Those who were granted ownership occupied it at the pleasure of the government, and at the peril of losing it back to that same power whenever it wanted the land. Not so in the United States of America. In this nation, from the very beginning, private ownership of the land was undertaken as a right of the people. Government's jobs was to make sure that no one could unjustly take that land or control how it was used or trespass over it against the owner's will. And such a form of government is not a democracy. Democracy, the idea that the majority rules, can be a lynch mob crying for action against the individual it has deemed guilty. If the law says that we must first try him, the lynch mob cries, we can't wait for the slow wheels of justice to turn. Somebody must do something now. Democracy is three wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for lunch. But in a republic, even if the majority dislikes how a property owner uses his land, the government protects his right to do so, so long as he is not infringing on the same rights as others. It's too bad if he has 4 cars parked on his property, 1 on jacks, or decides to paint his house purple with a green door. The land is his, bought and paid for. The Founding Fathers, particularly James Madison, took those ideas to heart and put them in the Constitution, particularly in the Fifth Amendment. It limits government's taking of private property, saying no American shall, quote, be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. That means in the courts. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This is a guarantee to Americans that they are safe and free to pursue their own lives without the interference of government. In fact, it says the government's job is to protect those liberties so that they can pursue their lives. Without those guarantees, there can be no society. Chaos and tyranny would replace order and prosperity. And it was guaranteed by those protections. Americans began to work their land. With their free minds, they invented new approaches and created new jobs and found new ways to prosper. As a result, our standard of living improved, science improved health care, life expectancy increased, and wealth followed. Americans began to carve an incredible society out of the barren wilderness, and in just 200 short years, we've surpassed ancient cultures. America became the envy of the world because Americans were free individuals, able to choose their own way of life, able to pursue their own dreams, live like nowhere else on earth, able to worship and live in their lives their way, whether it was politically correct or not. Ideas mattered. Difference of opinion and the right to express it were an important tool to our freedom, all possible because of the right of the people to own private property. And such visions of freedom have become our legacy. Today, as we are attacked by running dog terrorists, the nation rallies around the mantra of freedom. Flags fly from our homes and our car antennas, bumper stickers declare, "God bless America," and banners shout, "Let freedom ring." But do we still have those freedoms granted to us from the wisdom of our founding fathers? Or is our pride now based mostly on propaganda and memories from a bygone era? See for yourself. In a free society, individuals have almost limitless rights to travel where and how they please, arm themselves, buy or consume any product they choose, teach their children their values, own property and build on it, start a new business just based on an idea, keep their financial affairs private, and keep their earnings in their pocket for their own use. In a free society, individuals are free to pursue their lives without the forced intervention of moralists, do-gooders, and busybodies. So how are we doing as a free society? Well, you may recognize that today, every single one of those things I just mentioned is either regulated or banned. And those moralists, do-gooders, and busybodies are called government. In fact, I believe that the American people and their every action are being ruled, regulated, restricted, licensed, registered, directed, checked, inspected, measured, numbered, counted, rated, stamped, censored, authorized, admonished, refused, prevented, drilled, indoctrinated, monopolized, extorted, robbed, hoaxed, fined, harassed, disarmed, dishonored, fleeced, exploited, assessed, and taxed to the point of suffocation and desperation. Ben Franklin, when asked, "What sort of government have you given us?" replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." We haven't. And how have we lost it? We forgot that a free society can only exist when the people are free to own and control their own property. The fact is, no other rights can exist without private property. How can you have free speech if you aren't allowed to control your own property? James Madison said private property ownership, quote, embraces everything to which man may attach value and have a right. Watch how other liberties are eroded as we lose control of property rights. Millions of Americans are now forced to stand outside their workplace in order to participate in the legal activity of smoking a cigarette. Even if you own the building, government regulations tied to occupancy permits prevent you from allowing your own employees and tenants to smoke inside if you so desire. Now, proponents say this is not an issue of property rights. Rather, it's a matter of health to stop a very filthy, dangerous habit. Besides, you say, office buildings are public places. Then explain to me how the same regulations are being shifted to regulate smoking in private homes. Now, how can they do this? Well, according to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, which is seeking such regulations, your home is the workplace of repairmen and those who provide services in your homes. Therefore, your home should come now under the same regulations that government office buildings have to be under, because it's just for the public good. Now, in a free society, we would simply tell such meddlers to get out of our house. This is my castle. You can't tell me what to do in my own home. And you know, many Americans still think they have the right to say that. Only they don't. Government enforcers have the power to charge fines, place liens, and jail property owners who do not comply. And it's easy to support such actions because it's easy to hate smoking. And I imagine a majority of the people in this room really don't like such a filthy habit. But you know, I've never smoked, but I've always supported the rights of those who do. Those of you who hate smoking should remember, warnings have been issued time and time again that once the smoking police used and abused the government to destroy this right, then they would turn the power onto something else, perhaps something that you would like to do. And so now they have. Obesity is the new crusade by the do-gooders of the world. Now, how can the fight to stop fat people be an assault on private property? Well, they're working from the exact same playbook used to assault the tobacco industry. In fact, it's the same lawyers. Now, did you think that smoking, the whole smoking issue was about health? It's always been about money and power. This new fight is taking on absurd proportions, pun intended. The food police accuse restaurants of selling servings that are too large. They want to regulate the size of the servings. They issue hysterical reports on the dangers of Chinese food and Mexican food, French fries, butter, salt, sugar, hot fudge, sundaes, and almost anything else that's good. They want to hold restaurants responsible for patrons who drink too much, just like the gun haters want to hold gun manufacturers responsible because some goofball shoots somebody. And the food police want fat taxes on all sodas and snacks. It doesn't matter if you want to spend your money on these things. It doesn't matter that you might like these things. Ronald McDonald has replaced Joe Camel as public enemy number one. And those who have declared themselves to be our protectors have determined that public good is at stake and we are facing an emergency of obesity. Why is this a public issue? Because we now have socialized medicine, and fat people are eating up medical tax dollars because they aren't as healthy as the tofu munchers. At least that's how the do-gooders argue it. So the public must decide what you eat with public good at stake. In a free society, restaurant owners wouldn't worry about such wackos. They would just turn around, tell them to stay out of their establishment. But you see, we're no longer a free society. We have allowed the Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, and a horde of state and local bureaucrats to use licensing policies to blackmail business owners from using their own property as they wish. Now, every day, newspapers and televisions are full of another hysterical report, usually in the form of a news release, so much science involved, of some new threat to our comfort and security. And our response as American people? Somebody do something. We don't have time to wait for the wheels of justice to turn. In the state of Maryland, close to where I live, one state delegate provided a terrifying example of disregard for the rule of law. Recently, the state legislature debated a bill to expand the ability of the police to tap phones, eavesdrop on the email and internet activities of suspected criminals. It's part of the deluge of invasive legislation ripping apart the Constitution in the name of fighting terrorism. Now, during the debate, Maryland-Montgomery County Delegate Dana Lee Dembrow said, quote, "I realize that this bill basically says you can tap someone's phone for jaywalking, and normally I'd say no way. But after what happened on September 11th, I say screw 'em." Screw who? You? Me? Anyone who gets in the government's way? I thought his motivation was to get terrorists. Fingers don't work. In short, the rule of law in complex times has proven to be deficient. We Americans now much prefer the rule of man. It's vastly more efficient. The fact is, while insisting that they are not infringing on property rights, government enforcers have infringed on our rights of free assembly, freedom of speech, free expression, and free choice by holding our property hostage. You can't smoke that on these grounds. You can't eat that in this establishment. You can't do that in your own home. What happens if I don't comply? Then the lynch mob and I will take control of your property and stop you. And step by step, we are eliminating property rights in America, and that means we are eliminating freedom. In fact, we seem to have one property right left, the right to keep paying taxes and the mortgage payment as we live by the permission of the government. Now, who's to blame for this invasion of American private property rights? The bureaucrats? The elected officials? Environmentalists? No, not directly. The American people are to blame. They have created the atmosphere to allow hordes of government agents and their buddy do-gooders to rush in and grab control. Too many people in America have accepted the idea that they have the right to tell other people what to do with their private lives and their property. And they believe that there is nothing wrong with using the power of government to enforce those ideas. You see, they have become the lynch mob. John Adams said, quote, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence." Is that not what we have done? Do we want leaders who stand for the rule of law, or do we select candidates based on what kind of goodies they promise to dish out? The truth is, we keep electing politicians who offer the best argument on how to use that government power. We select our leaders today based on which ones have the best plan for collecting taxes, the best plan for restricting land use, the best plan for providing government-restricted medical care and drug prescriptions, and soon, if some get their way, the best plan to control what we eat. But no, you say, not me. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in property rights. I fight every day to limit the power of government. My friends, I believe that if I were to go around the room tonight, I ask for your definitions of property rights, I'd get at least 10 different answers. Do you support zoning laws? Do you support land development plans and restrictions? Do you support restrictions on businesses and where they can be placed? Do you support how waterways are used? Do you support historic preservation? Do you support restrictions on building designs to create uniformity? Do you support community growth management? Are you an active member of your homeowners association? Answer yes to any one of these items, and you support telling your neighbor what to do with his property. You are guilty of private property rights violations. You have helped diminish our nation's freedoms, and you have allowed yourself to become the root of the problem. And that's pretty harsh, isn't it? And I know that you believe you have legitimate reasons for supporting some of these things. You've been led to believe that if you don't have zoning, then someone could put a stinky old pig farm right next to your beautiful new home, and your property values will go down. They tell you if you don't restrict how the waterways are used, they will become polluted. People and corporations, of course, cannot be trusted to do the right thing. Others say that if you don't protect historic places, they will be lost forever. Developers, those evil people, will destroy them all. Still others warn that if you don't support planned community growth, urban sprawl will suck up all the land, and I want my community to stay small and rural. Yeah, perhaps all of these things are true. But in every case, you are telling someone else how to use their land. In every case, you are licensing the government to infringe on someone else's property rights. And what happens if a bigger mob doesn't like what you're doing with your land? Once the precedent has been established, the monster is out of the bag. There is no turning back. Once you have legitimized the government power to restrict use of private property, then it will do what government does best. It will seek more power. Soon, it will suck up everything in the path until you wake up to find the real 800-pound gorilla, sustainable development, living on your property. And I'll tell you, that too will affect your property values. In fact, it will turn them to zero. So what is sustainable development? Well, one hint, it's not an environmental policy. It's not communism. It's a clever mix of fascism and socialism. Perhaps a better term would be commonism. Common borders, common currencies, common property, commonism. Imagine an America in which a specific ruling principle is created to decide proper societal conduct for every citizen. That principle would be used to consider everything you eat, what you wear, the kind of home you live in, the way you get to work, the way you dispose of waste, the number of children you may have, even your education and employment decisions. Imagine, too, that all of these decisions are called voluntary, but that the central government would use its full power to induce what it deems correct behavior. Puts a new spin on political correctness, doesn't it? Sustainable development is that ruling principle for the implementation of what former Vice President Al Gore said we must all suffer through in order to purify our nation from the horrors of the 20th century's Industrial Revolution. That revolution that gave you your high standard of living. In his book, Earth in the Balance, Gore called it a wrenching transformation of society. And consequently, sustainable development calls for changing the very infrastructure of the nation away from private ownership and control of property to nothing short of national zoning. In such a system, the federal government, backed by an army of private non-governmental organizations, NGOs, like the Sierra Club, Planned Parenthood, the National Education Association, the National Governors Association, the National Mayors Association, the National Association of State Legislatures, the National Association of County Commissioners, will influence, if not dictate, policy in state government and local communities. Locally elected officials will no longer be the single driving force to make decisions for their communities. Most will be done behind the scenes in non-elected sustainability councils, armed with truckloads of federal regulations, guidelines, and money. Sustainability, sustainable communities, sustainable development, sustainable agriculture is not a comprehensive approach to environmental protection. In the report from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, terms such as harness market forces describe proposals to impose consumption taxes on products that management deems to be unsustainable. Remember the fat taxes I mentioned? And that management is not elected governments. Rather, it's those appointed sustainability councils and their NGO buddies who basically dictate policy to city councils and county commissioners and state governments. According to sustainable development policies, air conditioning, convenience foods, single-family housing, and cars are among the products that have been already to be determined as unsustainable. In your packets, you have a much larger list. It's shocking. The logo used in sustainable development literature depicts 3 connecting circles, each labeled with a defining category of the ruling principle. One is labeled social equity, another economic prosperity, and the third ecological integrity. Well, they sound innocent enough, but these three categories encompass every aspect of human life. To achieve the goals behind those three very basic items would demand unlimited government authority to control business decisions, eliminate private property and personal achievement, and create a completely managed society under top-down bureaucratic control. Social equity and social justice require that the earth's wealth be shared between those who produce and those who do not. It's every welfare program and wealth redistribution scheme ever proposed. Under sustainable development, business is little more than a tool of the social planning managers. Partnerships between business and government decide what kinds of products are to be produced, who will produce them, and how they will be produced. And all must be done in accordance with very strict, environmentally correct procedures. And taxes, to force compliance, will ensure proper business conduct. And ecological integrity. Well, that's just the excuse for the social planners to sucker you and me into the enforcement of their timeless schemes for power. In the name of protecting the environment, in the name of social equity and justice, in the name of safety and prosperity, sustainable development is fast becoming official policy in the federal government, state government, and every large city and small burg in America. Those behind it are powerful, well-funded, well-placed, and well-organized. No matter how crazy the plan, they are succeeding in building support from the American people. Here's how. Your community is now a sustainable community. In fact, Santa Cruz is the poster child for Agenda 21. Your elected officials are some of the first in the nation to seek full implementation of the plan. See if this doesn't sound familiar to you. Have you heard your officials talking about how to curtail growth and block development? Read your front page of your paper today. Are they talking about historic preservation? Are they talking about how to control business? Has the subject of public transportation come up? Is it getting more difficult to enjoy driving your car around town? I see the parking meters are going to go up about 50%. Here is the definition of a sustainable community from the President's Council's report. Quote, listen carefully. Sustainable communities encourage people to work together to create healthy communities where natural resources and historic resources are preserved, jobs are available, sprawl is contained, neighborhoods are secure, education is lifelong, transportation and health care are accessible, and all citizens have opportunities to improve the quality of their lives. If only our founding fathers could have thought of that. So now let's break it down. How do you actually achieve these goals? Again, see if these things don't sound familiar. How do the people work together? Well, we need some sort of committee or council to join. One that will set a vision for the city. We need all of our leaders, from elected officials to educators to business leaders to the local chamber of commerce to the local news media. They will put a plan together for the future development of our community. And by the way, that plan isn't really written by the committee. It's from a blueprint out of Washington, D.C. Now, to see that the committee can really achieve its goals, it needs to have some teeth. We need a partnership between the committee and government. A plan will be drawn up, and it will be the guideline for legislation and laws and regulations. Individual landowners and businessmen can't be trusted to share the vision of their own. They must have such guidelines to protect public open spaces and historic buildings. The committee then must control the use of all private property. It must decide what is historic and what must be preserved. It must set boundaries beyond where no new homes may be built. It must decide how the community should look, where open space should be, where businesses can be allowed to operate. But we must do more. The vision can't become reality unless the people in the community have the proper respect for the plan. They must have the right attitudes, values, and beliefs in order to support what the good folks on the committee are trying to do for the common good of us all. Now, one place to start is in the schools. Here are our future generations. It is not important that they can read and write and perform math as it is to understand the importance of living together with your neighbors in a happy, prosperous, safe, well-organized community. They can learn basic academics on their own, but it's vital that they understand our plans and our goals. So let's add some classes to help them obtain the proper outlook for the future. Teach them that they must work together rather than selfishly pursuing their own goals. Teach them that our community needs only certain kinds of workers to help the program along. Help them select career paths that fit the needs of the community. Help them understand that personal wants and dreams and ambitions are selfish and will only hurt everyone else's future. Now, how best to teach them these things? Well, businesses know how to organize. Let's form a partnership with businesses to help the children learn about work right there in school. In fact, we can even let the children take half of each school day to go on the job as a volunteer. To make sure that everyone participates, we'll make it part of their grade. And to make sure that they always keep the valuable lessons and don't stray away from the special teachings they've learned in the school-to-work partnership, let's keep their education going for life. We'll require that they come back for refresher courses periodically through their lives. To protect our sustainable community, we've got to make sure that everyone maintains the proper attitudes, values, and beliefs. And to make sure that they do attend these lifelong learning classes, we'll use that partnership with business as an on-the-job incentive. That way, lifelong learning can lead to better jobs and better pay. Gosh, it's all so well organized. And for the adults, you're not going to get out of this. There can be public visioning classes for them, too. After all, we can't fully organize our community around our grand idea if there is resistance from some of the people. That will spoil all our great plans and the health and security of the community. So again, with our business partnerships and with the help of the Chamber of Commerce and the schools, we'll work with the folks on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis. The United Nations has such a program to use as our guideline. Chattanooga, Tennessee did it. So can we. Neighborhood by neighborhood, we can bring the folks in, teach them how important it is to protect the environment and how evil sprawl is, to all of our well-laid plans. And once we have helped them obtain the proper attitudes, values, and beliefs, we can set up lifelong learning classes and business partnerships for adults, too. We must take care of our elderly and our sick. Doctors must not be so greedy. We'll set up government-sponsored clinics with tax-paid health care so all can afford it. After all, we have a right to be taken care of when we're sick. Doctors will just have to form a partnership of their own with a committee and accept a decent salary. It's all for the public good. Cars are a nasty habit. We must teach our community that everyone should be more open to public transportation. We must build light rail trains and bus lines to get us around to our jobs. And to make it convenient for everyone, we'll design housing developments around the rail and bus lines so that they are within walking distance for everyone. We'll eliminate cars from the community, and that will relieve our overcrowded streets. Cars will be banned. Our homes can be designed in high and low-rise buildings with office space on top floors and stores on the main floors with our apartments sandwiched in between. We'll never have to leave the building during our daily routine. So we don't need yards that have to be mowed by those smelly, gas-guzzling, air-polluting, noise-polluting mowers. We'll just provide parks and open green space for the people to find recreation. The committee will actively seek to bring business to the community to provide jobs for our people. But we only want certain kind of businesses here. We won't accept those who lack the proper environmental attitudes. They will either comply or be banned from operating in our community. And if we don't have enough jobs after all that, we'll just tax the businesses that are here to raise the necessary funds to help those who don't have one. Social equity is key to our community's plan. And people must have homes and medical care and food. It's their right. It's the duty of those who have money to help those who don't, especially the businesses which are so rich. There are other things the community will find necessary to ban in order to assure that the citizens have the opportunity to improve their lives. Of course, with low and high-rise public housing, single-family homes that waste precious land won't be necessary. Suburban housing will be banned. We must also look at the public health of our people. They must eat properly. That's why we can't allow precious farmland in our county to be wasted on raising cattle for beef consumption, because beef is harmful to your health, so it will be banned. Wheat and soy will be grown on the land instead. Ever had a delicious Thanksgiving dinner of tofurkey? With our new healthy diet, as outlined by the committee, we will no longer need things like 7-Elevens and McDonald's and their unhealthy fast food and snacks. They will be banned. There's one more danger to our happiness and security for our community that must be addressed: overpopulation. The committee will decide the number of folks who can comfortably live in our community limits, sustainably, you see. If we don't control the population, we will be overrun. Some strict guidelines must be imposed for the sake of the community's well-being and for the protection of our environment. Birth control, education, and supplies will be a major part of the process for keeping the population down. But if our folks don't heed the committee's warnings that the people begin to exceed our limits, drastic action will be required. Limits on the number of children a family may have will have to be imposed. Those conceiving children against those limits will have to pay a high price. Fines, of course, imprisonment for exceptional cases. Now, what to do about those yet unborn but illegal babies? Action must be taken for the sake of us all in the community. Do you understand where we're headed, my friends? Name the issue. Name the aspect of your life that is not affected by such a mentality. All of this and much more is the future under sustainable development. I say again, this is not about preserving the environment for future present generations. Sustainable development is the greatest threat ever perpetrated against American liberty. There can be no hope of living in a nation of limited government with sustainable development as official government policy. The two are diametrically opposed. As I said, sustainable development is a clever mix of socialism and fascism neatly tucked in a green cloak. And many throughout the nation are either falling for the deception or ignoring it as a non-threat. Every American who cherishes liberty must know that sustainable development is our enemy and that it must be ripped from government policy at every level. My friends, Americans would never concede their liberty to swastikas and hammer and sickles, but you tuck it all in a green blanket for environmental protection and we'll toss it on the fire like a good old-fashioned book burning. The fact is, sustainable development is a social planner's dream of utopia. They think that they just have to dictate the policies, make you comply, and they will create the perfect world. And there is no regard for your opinion, no reservation for your property or business, no hesitation to consider your pain. And experience has proven them to be right, to believe that we will follow their dictates with few questions and fewer protests. This is about totalitarianism. It's about controlling every aspect of our lives with decisions made by committees that will grow more powerful and more oppressive with each passing day as each new regulation proposed by a newly empowered special interest group. There will be no satisfying their lust for power. There will be no part of our lives that is overlooked or controlled. Our homes, our food, our babies, our liberty. There can be no private property under sustainable development. There can be no free enterprise under sustainable development. There can be no individual liberty under sustainable development. Group thought, group plans, group action is how the community will work together. It will be justified as we are constantly told that we're all in this crisis together. A crisis, of course, that has been artificially created by these very policies. Usually, When politicians talk about sustainable development, they talk about environmental programs like the Endangered Species Act, and wetlands regulations, and conservation easements, watersheds, viewsheds, heritage areas, heritage corridors, heritage sites, historic preservation, rails to trails, zoning, CARA, energy consumption, greenways, biosphere reserves, biodiversity, environmental impact statements, global warming, and the Wildlands Project. Please understand that these are simply the tools and excuses being used to dismantle our society and our culture. And to stop them, we must first understand the character of the perpetrators and their true goals. But more importantly, we must understand the root of our own culture and the values that produced our nation with the highest standard of living ever known in human history. We must understand that it is free men operating in free markets untethered by government regulation that allows men to find solutions to hunger, decent housing, superior medical care, education, overcrowded highways, and human happiness. We must understand that it is only bad government that causes poverty and overpopulation and environmental damage. Totalitarianism, socialism, fascism, and almost every other ism are the root of suffering on earth. We must understand that none of this could be happening in this country where the founding fathers made private property rights the premier right, unless we had first accepted the premise that we have a right to tell our neighbor what to do with his property. The logo of sustainable development, with its 3 connecting circles, should be viewed by all who love liberty as the new swastika of our era. There is no greater threat to our way of life. It is the reason our schools are producing pliable, illiterate idiots. They are destined to become the citizens of tomorrow in a life of drudgery in the sustainable world. It should come as no surprise that you can trace the roots of the sustainable development concept to the United Nations. Specifically, as I said before, the blueprint is a United Nations program called Agenda 21. It is a product of the 1992 Youth Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And it outlines the means for complete restructuring of a nation to fit the desired mold. Agenda 21 outlines in detail the UN's vision of a completely managed society, dictating the process to be used for industry, agriculture, housing development, and even education curriculum in the classroom. The federal government's drive to acquire and control massive amounts of land is necessary for the full implementation of Agenda 21. Sustainable development is anti-science. It is anti-knowledge. It is anti-human. It is anti-reason. In a nutshell, sustainable development is designed to throw out virtually everything man has learned since the beginning of time. It is the creed of the mindless savage who seeks brute force over reasoned thought. And if we don't learn of its evil now, if we don't heed the warning, if we don't rip it out at every level of government policy by its well-entrenched roots, then American life, indeed human existence as we know it, will enter a new dark ages of pain and misery unlike any ever experienced by the community of man. And still, Americans cannot see the danger of dictating to their neighbors as to what they can do with their own property. Until one day, the social planner comes for ours. And then we seek to organize to stop what we call the government's land grab. Suddenly we stand alone on our own property, warding off federal agents lamenting that it isn't fair that they are taking our land. Perhaps on that day, all Americans will begin to recognize that the only difference between a homeowners association dictating the color you can paint your front door and total federal control of society is the size of the dictator's power. But such a reckoning will come too late. The United Nations, Agenda 21, and the President's Council on Sustainable Development are just homeowners associations on steroids. And the truth is, none of these schemes could have taken root in America, home of the brave and land of the free, unless we had first accepted the very premise that it's okay to dictate how your neighbor uses his property. And now we face the consequences. Sustainable development is being accepted by Americans across this nation because they have been made to feel afraid. They are afraid of urban sprawl and crowded highways. They fear their communities will lose their local flavor. So they look for answers through the heavy hand of more government, that same government that caused many of those problems in the first place. And the politicians are playing on that fear to give themselves more power. And that, too, is how sustainable development works. But it's an agenda that ultimately doesn't work, because government control of individuals is a bankrupt scheme proven as a failure time and time again throughout history. And that's why it can be stopped. You have an excellent start here in Santa Cruz. In spite of the tremendous odds that you face, Freedom 21 Santa Cruz is a model for the nation. You've taken the first steps. You're organizing and you're learning. The key to victory is to first understand your enemy, know where he is headed, and you can cut him off at every turn. Arm yourselves first with that knowledge, and then step by step, take back your community, and then take back America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for taking the time to come all the way out here to visit us and to educate us. He'll be around for a while after we're all done. Let me introduce to you now a local resident. He's an abundance ecologist, and he actually sat on the local UN Agenda 21 committee. Let me introduce to you now a man who is amongst the group of people behind Freedom 21 in Santa Cruz, Michael Shaw.
Thank you, Tom. My job is to add a little information about what's happening in Santa Cruz and how it is that we're fitting and actually implementing this worldwide agenda that is intended to create a global collective of which we will all be voluntary participants. But to do that, I want to describe briefly my sense of what private property is. So often in a community like this, private property has been made to be an ugly word. We've had politicians for the last 20 years who have attributed to anyone who considered private property to be a value worth considering to be selfish. Well, the demagogue has got away with it for long enough. Because private property, when you really get to the point, begins with your hand. It's your private property. It's your hand. And that extends to your mind. They're your thoughts. That's your private property. And it proceeds to how you express yourself and to the action you take in your daily life. Some of that action produces goods that you either create or trade for. Most people think that's what private property is. But if you take away that thing or that good, you begin to affect what people's actions become. And you know that if the product of your efforts to be taken from you, it affects how you speak, pretty soon how you think, until you wake up one day and you find out that your hand is part of the global collective. So private property is the essence and the root of who we are and what we want to become. It's an idea that's not only important for yourself to consider, but the essence of the struggle that Tom is describing is that we must recognize that private property, our neighbor's private property, is the key to securing our own. And when we abandon our neighbor's right to the use of their goods or their land, we abandon our own future and we destroy the prospects for posterity. So no more to those politicians in our town who confuse us with these notions. As Roy said, I sat on the Santa Cruz local Agenda 21 committees in the mid-90s. I thought it was too crazy to take seriously, so I forgot about it. But in 2001, I began to see early 2001 committees and councils being formed all across this county. Community plans, watershed councils, fire safe councils, councils. I said, what is this? With a little bit of discovery, I came to find out that our Board of Supervisors quietly and unanimously in 1997 adopted the local Agenda 21 committees. This document is the United Nations document. You can see the word sustainable development in Agenda 21. In the early days, and Jeannie Soderman here, before I understood sustainable development or Agenda 21, would go to various council meetings and talk about Agenda 21, and you could see the implementers. They would mock and make fun of the entire idea. Conspiracy theorists, they said. Well, this is the United Nations document. You can see the terms in their own words. Sustainable development has 2 action plans, and this is a model community for those action plans. The first is the Wildlands Project, which seeks to eliminate human presence on over 50% of the American landscape. The people in the mountains and the people in the Pajaro Valley can begin to see that rolling out as ordinance after ordinance, piece by piece, clink by clink, begins to web a design to move the people off and to take their property. And then we have smart growth, championed by people like Mark Primick in our town. Wildlands is championed by Morty Wormhout. You get a choice. You can either have the wildlands taken from you, or you can be grouped into the smart growth communities, which are government-private partnerships intended to restructure how we live. Smart growth are dense human settlements. Now, that's the United Nations term that you'll find in the local Agenda 21 document. Subject to increasing controls on how we live and increasing restrictions on our mobility. This is not a Democrat thing, and it's not a Republican thing. Both party machineries, the National Education Association and the American Planning Association, along with many others, are charged with the implementation of this. In 1992, George Bush signed the Rio Accords. We didn't hear about it, but the Rio Accords are Agenda 21. Later, President Clinton, by executive order, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. And since then, other branches of government have begun to implement it. Interesting enough about Santa Cruz, we voted in 1990 for Measure C, the Decade of the Environment, written, I understand, by Gary Patton. That measure looks the same, nearly identical, to what was announced by the United Nations in 1992 at the Rio Conference. Santa Cruz was the early trial seed. This is a map of the Wildlands Project, smuggled out of Geneva 2 days before the Senate took the vote that was to pass to ratify the biodiversity treatment, a 1,200-page document that puts nature and bugs, even rocks, before the interests of man. The red is to be totally devoid of human activity, and only the lavender is where we're to be. If you look at the west, you can see how it is that our farmers, our ranchers, our timber operators, and mineral operators are being squeezed out of their businesses and off their land. The ones that remain are the corporate partners of government. But how does that bring it right home to us here in Santa Cruz? Well, I talked about the councils. Many councils, all set up to do their little piece of the pie. Action Pajaro Valley is part of that system. Now, they deny it. They get nervous if you bring up the word Agenda 21. Well, we've never heard of that. But they have a flyer. Action, A is for Agenda 21, C is for community, T is for team, in operation now. But they've never heard of Agenda 21.
Pretty sneaky.
The boundary of Action Pajaro Valley, it includes Corralitos, where the Corralitos Community Plan is now enveloping, and La Selva Beach, which also has a community plan being thrust upon us by the planning department and their chosen participants in the community in a consensus, a facilitated consensus process where the outcome is predetermined and where citizens are marginalized if they don't go along. Here's the broader system, which includes Action Pajaro Valley and the new one that is forming in Santa Cruz called Santa Cruz Clusters. A lot of innocent people are involved in this, don't get me wrong. A lot of people are taking the poison candy that's coming in the form of grants from the federal government, grants from the state government, grants from big name aristocratic foundations. These are all linked together. This is their paperwork, it's not ours. But Central California is just one region. It's to regionalize us and take us out of our system of separation of powers and checks and balances. There's the California Center for Regional Leadership, always with fine, soft, fuzzy words. Before I take it up through the national international scheme, I'll talk about an NGO, a non-governmental organization formed by the United Nations that exists in Montreal, Canada. The purpose of this organization, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, has a partnership with Santa Cruz. If you go to their website, remember they're in communities across this country to implement the UN objectives. In Santa Cruz, we're one of 3 communities in the country they acknowledge not only is doing a perfect job of implementing Agenda 21, but that here we even use the term Agenda 21. Aren't we proud? These are the ICLEI hubs around the world. The one in Canada that I just talked about is to control and implement the local initiatives in the United States. This is the nationwide version of what we saw earlier for California, how these things are coordinated and centered. What we have is an apex system of councils. And as I'm going through this process and learning this ugly, ugly story, I thought, you know, what does Soviet mean? And I don't know what made me ask that question, but with a little investigation, here's the definition of Soviet, something not taught in our government schools. A Soviet is a system of councils that report to an apex to implement a predetermined outcome, the members of whom have to be compatible and agreeable to the ultimate outcome. That's called the consensus process. Trained facilitators are put in charge of this, so-called change agents. That means to change or reinvent American government from a constitutional framework to a Soviet one. What we are seeing is the establishment of an American Soviet. Here's our final worldwide eco-village as the plans come fully in place. You say, well, that can't happen. This is America. We're not going to go for that. Well, there's 2 ways to take over a country. One is with an army, and the other was with fraud and deceit. So where would fraud and deceit take us? What would it deliver for us? Well, you boil down political philosophy, and I'm not going to make a big talk about this, but there's 2. It's one where you either run your own life or where the state runs it for you. Collectivism is the idea where individuality is suppressed by the state. You take the job the state gives you, you have your children trained by the state, etc. The components of state control include, first, reading from the bottom, the idea that you've got to have a military capacity that can be aggressive. You need to have a potential for imperialism. That's particularly important for the 21st century if you want collectivism, because if liberty survives anywhere, collectivism will not win. That's why holding America becomes so important, because we are the only place on earth that holds a value for individual liberty. And that's why we're under such attack. And that's why sustainable development is not talked about in this country. It is around the rest of the world. Plug in Agenda 21 to your computer model, and you'll find 1 million sites. It's open and available everywhere but here. And why is that? Well, make your own judgment. The second component is that you need government control of the monetary system. We did that in 1913. We formed the first big government-private partnership. Some guys control the American monetary system, what Thomas Jefferson and Jackson fought so hard to prevent. And now, 90 years later, the fruit is being borne. Big money has been made by some private interests. Over 90 years, the money power necessary to implement sustainable development with grant monies flowing everywhere. Next, you need child indoctrination, and at Freedom 21, we're going to talk about that a lot in the days coming forward, because we don't know generally as parents what's happening in our schools, and our teachers oftentimes don't understand what they're doing, with federal programs being massively shoved down the schools in every town in this country. Ideas that we would not agree with, that no one, except those who want to seek power and control over others, would agree with. But finally, what's needed and what's being worked on now is that you can't have a collective unless you control the land and the natural resources. Well, Santa Cruz is a great place to try to do that. You know, what's differentiated America from every country in the history of the world is that citizens have controlled and managed the land and natural resources. The first avenue for the sustainable development attack is to take those assets and put them into government's hands or into the hands of their corporate partners. And if you talk to the timber people, the farming people, and the rest of the natural resource people in this country, you'll find out what kind of attack they're on. And when we lose our natural resources, they call all the shots. They got the army, they got the monetary system, they've got the educational system, and now they'll hold the natural resources. Everything in this room, everything we own, has its root in our rural lands. Freedom depends on citizen management and citizen control of our rural lands. Without it, the city folks are doomed to suffer. How does this happen in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? That's the flip side of the question of, how do we get it back? We have a Congress where the vote is oftentimes 434 to 1. Watch that one man. If that one man could become Speaker of the House, America would be saved. Because what it would mean is that America had woken up and found its root in the ideals of freedom and an understanding of what private property is, and we would change our Congress, who would put a rope on our president as our founders had intended, and not make an imperial power sitting in the hands of one man. Recently, after a number of events like this, Congressman Sam Farr was asked about Agenda 21. This time the camera was on him, with an attitude that you wouldn't want to see in your children. He said, "I've never heard of it." This letter is from Congressman Sam Farr in 1997, when they were feeling a little more cocky about Agenda 21. They just got it through the Board of Supervisors. He says, "I am writing to congratulate you, the Advisory Board and Action Santa Cruz County Coalition, for completing the local Agenda 21 plan." Watch the 3 E's. The 3 E's are intended to replace life, liberty, and property as the central organizing principle of American society. Here he says, "I support the principle of sustainable development to balance the needs of economic growth." That means international redistribution. Environmental stewardship. That means nature before man. And social equity. That means social engineering, the types of which we're seeing in our schools. You see, collectivism requires an army or deceit. Earlier this year, I asked Mr. Patton on the radio if he knew about Agenda 21. He too said, "No, I've been hearing a little about that lately." In today's newspaper, once you understand the nature of sustainable development, and by the way, some of our news sources in this county do consider themselves to be partners of an emerging government of a one world order. But in today's newspaper, we can see judge dismisses water suit. Well, let me tell you about the water in this town a little bit. Again, there's some researchers that can trace to the World Bank the World Plan for Water. Control the water, you control the people. That plan says that you use water to create these dense human settlements over time. And ultimately, human beings are to use 10 gallons of water per day. That is, of course, sustainable. Well, to get there, in this county, we have what's called the Sierra Club Water Conservation Plan. Has anybody heard of that? Well, our Board of Supervisors, on the consent calendar, not long ago, adopted it as the official water policy of this county. The Sierra Club Water Plan calls for the consolidation of all water districts in this county into public works. Now, we were told that the goal of sustainable development is to create crises that can then be solved by further government intervention. Is there a crisis for water in this lightly populated rain zone? Well, the farmers are being told there are. They're being taxed to pump their own water that they're pulling out of the ground. And that's what the headline was all about. We have the San Lorenzo Water District selling off millions of dollars of forest land that now is in the hands of the supervisors, becoming part of Castle State Park, the United Nations heritage site that is intended to be devoid of all human activity. So if you're a recreationist and you don't care about all of these things, well, your recreation's going to be nubbed too in the not distant future. We're seeing that coming piece by piece across the country as roads are closed and activities are limited. On the bottom half of this page, we have a large corporation in this town that is working with the federal government to create a habitat conservation plan. Granite Rock tackles habitat preservation for one-of-a-kind insects at Quail Hollow site. Well, the story behind that is this. The feds have been in town for about a year and a half, Department of Interior, working behind the scenes in an effort first to dupe the fire chiefs into creating a county-wide habitat conservation plan. Now, began with 110 species on this plan, got narrowed down to only 60. And the idea is that if you have any one of these bugs or plants on your property, or the potential for it, and you want to do anything with your property, you must voluntarily comply, those are the words, voluntarily comply with the Department of Interior's species by species restrictions. Now, what does that mean? Well, the chairman of the Fire Safe Council, Fire Chief Gary Smith of Aptos, wrote later in a letter to the federal government that he didn't think that citizens, and I'm paraphrasing this, but he didn't think that citizens would appreciate being told they couldn't walk on their property. Because that's the result of this plan. If it is the mating season for the red-legged frog, you can't walk on your land. Now, a few of us in this room held the fire chiefs to some accountability, embarrassed the feds and the state and the planning people who were in that room. One by one, they dropped off. But don't think the day was saved, because it wasn't. Now they're working behind closed doors down at the planning department. Okay? What's happening at Granite, my surmise is that that's to butter up the public for the glory of protecting the bugs and the animals at the expense of human beings in a free society. How else does Agenda 21 crop itself in this community? Well, it's many, many ways, but I'll give a couple of examples because it's a mindset that we have to get used to. The Creekside Ordinance in Santa Cruz is a pure application of Agenda 21. For those who know, I'm not going to explain all of these. Those who've been familiar with it need to think of Creekside Ordinance in the context of the Agenda 21 Sustainable Development Model implementation. The Buena Vista annexation comes straight out of Action Paro Valley. Anybody thinks that's not part of Agenda 21 needs to study a little more. The West Cliff Road narrowing. You know, the goal is, you go down Capitola Road now, you got a lot of traffic, and they put these cute little planters in the middle of the road, taking a 4-lane road down to 2. That is part of the increasing restrictions on our mobility that are going to move inch by inch by inch. This SUV stuff. And community plans. Now, the county slowed down a little bit, but nobody needs to think that's a positive sign. They're just working more deceitfully. We're not seeing the community plans bubble up like they had expected them to. What needs to happen is that citizens need to organize. Okay? Not just for little defeats here and there, but for a wider exposure in this community of what sustainable development is and how they're doing it. Remember that tyranny prevails when good men do nothing. Edmund Burke said that over 200 years ago. The citizens of America knew what they were up against with King George. The question for us is, do we know? Well, once we understand it, it gets a lot easier. It's a whole lot easier to let this house of cards crumble. It's not having to face off an invading army. It's simply spread the word, stand up strong, speak out while we still can, because the day comes when it becomes too late. Tyranny knows no bounds. Those who lie will steal. Those who will lie and steal, history's taught us, will slay. Now is the time before humanity, for a long period, is subjected to a global elite tyranny. So it's a simple question. Do we return to the ideas that were never fully developed in this country? So it's not a simple return. Do we advance the ideas that our forefathers laid out for us? Well-considered notions that we've left in the dust because we'd rather protect our property value and abandon somebody else's right to their property. The result of that is going to be that we will end up with neither property rights or property values. So it's time to stop being short-sighted. The choice becomes simple. Choose the road. Understand what the road looks like, and that's easy enough to do once we open our minds to it. Choose the road, the high road or the low road. There are but two political theories to follow. Understand the ingredients of the one, and don't be fooled by the tangents of the other. And we can enter into an era unlike anything that human beings have ever seen. We've developed the knowledge, the technology, the science, to create a truly glorious world. And we don't do that by imposing that will on foreign nations. We do that by assuming it in our community and demanding it of our federal government. We need to read the 10th Amendment and restrict what it is our federal government is doing. It's not going to be an easy transition, but the alternative is to slink down that path. Agenda 21 takes us straight to regionalism and collectivism, implementing the United Nations Charter, where human beings are nothing more than biological resources. In fact, the Bureau of Land Management, in its working papers, working off a quote by Al Gore, says in the context of ecosystem management, that means the planet. Human beings are to be considered biological resources. That's our federal government. And you can go into every federal agency and you can find similar language. The time is not late, okay? They have some huge hurdles ahead of them. What works the best is to talk openly about Agenda 21 and sustainable development and say we want our community rid of it. I'll tell you what happens when you start talking in front of these councils about sustainable development now, and you start to be able to see people who have been implementing it, they get very quiet. They no longer mock people who talk about this. They get very quiet. After all, would you want to be holding this bag as an awakening begins? I don't think so. So let's just remember what individualism and individual liberty brings us. It brings us a world where we are free to develop our conscience. If you've got a bad conscience, you do things to harm people, you'll be taken care of. This isn't anarchy. But through that path, we've got the freedom to express. Increasingly, Americans are afraid to talk about their local school. Yeah, that school in the next county is no good, but they don't talk about their own school. They don't show up at their own schools and understand what the curriculum is. Try to go to one of the high schools in this county and get the curriculum. Oh. Let's exercise our freedom of expression. It will go away if we don't. So the message here tonight is, Tom is more than entertainment. I've seen him a few times this week around Northern California, and it gives me chills each time. But the issue is more than being entertained. This can be entertaining. We can have fun, but we got to do something. We need to organize. We need to talk to our neighbors. We need to advance the cause of freedom in the 21st century, or leave something very horrible to our posterity. I want to thank you for coming tonight, and long live freedom.
Stay here, we're going to do the question.